Okay, well, welcome everyone. It is 12:03, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Christina Hartlieb, and I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. If anyone has not seen the Stowe House lately, look at Abigail's background because she has a great picture of the house in full bloom right now. I'm jealous because I haven't downloaded those yet, but so we're going to get started, and I'm going to talk just for a few minutes to kind of introduce everything and then kind of tell you how we're going to work the etiquette part of all of this, because we do have a large discussion group. So the Harriet Beecher Stowe House is a historic site in Cincinnati. We tell the story of Harriet and her family. Her family lived in the house from the 1830s through the 40s. And it is because of the 18 years that Harriet lived in Cincinnati that enabled her to write the anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So we tell that story and then the continuing story of the house itself as well over time. This year, well, in all years, we do discussion groups, but this year's discussion group, the Semicolon Club, is specifically focusing on women's issues because it is the year of the woman. It is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So we're kind of paying homage to that. The Semicolon Club itself always meets the fourth Saturday every other month. So starting in February with a documentary, and then we continue discussions of different books in April, June, August, and October. So that's something that you can look forward to as well. In terms of the name, the Semicolon Club, it goes back to a literary society that was here in Cincinnati in the 1830s that Harriet was a part of. So it was a reading and writing group. Harriet really got her start, her writing career start through this group. And other members of the Semicolon Club at that time were her uncle, one of the Foote brothers, as well as a prominent doctor here in town named Daniel Drake. You may have heard of him. There was also, in addition to Harriet, her sister Catherine, Harriet's future husband, the biblical scholar Calvin Stowe, and his first wife, Eliza Stowe, and also a young lawyer by the name of Salmon P. Chase. He was also in the group as well. So that's the reason we call it the Semicolon Club, because it is our discussion group. So what we're going to do in terms of etiquette, because it's such a large group and we want to try to minimize distractions, if you are not currently speaking, make sure that you are on mute. And then also, if you're not speaking, go ahead and stop the video part. So we'll just see the screens with your name on it. And then when you are interested in asking a question, just type into the chat box that you want to go next in terms of questions, and then I'll call on you. And at that point, put your video and your audio back on so that we can see you when you're asking the question. So I think that, this is kind of a new situation for us, and because of the large group, that's the way we're going to try and see how it works, and hopefully that will go well. All right, so next up, I'm going to introduce Mackie McNeil, and she is one of the founders and chief prosperity persons of Mackie Advisors in Bellevue, Kentucky, and she's a founding member and former board member of the Matriots PAC, where she continues to chair the audit committee, and the Matriots are our series sponsor for the Semicolon Club, and so that's why we are partnering with them to bring you this discussion in an online version, since we can't meet at the house. So Mackie?
Thank you, Christina. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to have the Matriots PAC associated with the house in this discussion, the Semicolon Club. And we are, as you know, the Matriots mission is to elect more women to public office in Ohio to promote a healthy economy where women will thrive and prosper. So the fact that you are celebrating women in your semicolon club all year is a perfect opportunity for us to both support you and introduce ourselves to people in the community who may not know about us. We have been, the Matriots was started by a group of very energetic women who went to the first Women's March in DC and came home and said, we have to do something. We have to make a difference. To not act is to act. And so we are going to act. And they've been amazing. The founding group has formed a very vital organization that has endorsed many candidates throughout the state for state and local office. And it's their big dream is 50% of the elected officials in the state of Ohio would be women by the year 2028. So it's a big dream, a big goal. And as you know, women have been kind of stuck at that 25% range forever. So it's a big idea. We are on our way, and we've moved the needle from the last election, and we're hoping to move it again this time. So please check us out, learn more about the Matriots at the Matriots. It's just like Patriots, but with an M, matriotsohio.com. And it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the day, whose name is Barbara Furr. She is a longtime volunteer and one of the founding members of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. She's also formerly served as the Walnut Hills branch librarian. And I appreciate that Barbara is here sharing her wisdom with us today. And I'll turn it over to her and put myself on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. We at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House began the Semicolon Club quite a few years ago. And that was so that we could explore various issues, not only of the day, but of Harriet's Day. So this year is our Year of the Woman, and we are studying not only the suffragettes, but all women's issues. So today we're going to look at From Eve to Evolution, Darwin, Science, and Women's Rights in Gilded Age America. And to discuss this, and as one of our panelists, we have the author, Kimberly A. Hamlin. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. I think the host needs to unmute me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Great. It's so nice to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be one of the featured authors for the Year of the Woman of the Semicolon Book Club, and especially pleased to meet some of the Matriots in person. I was scheduled to do an event with the Matriots in 2 weeks after the book, Free Thinker, which we'll talk about today a little bit too, but that has been postponed for the pandemic. So I was especially excited to get this invitation to meet not only with our friends at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, but also with the Matriots, and to discuss my first book, From Eve to Evolution. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored and excited to be here. It's nice to see faces that are not in my house, and I'm really glad to be here. So they asked me to say a little bit about my book, how it came to be, and for this project. So that's I'll start. So this book, From Eve to Evolution, began as my dissertation at the University of Texas in Austin. When I was in graduate school, I was teaching this class called The Rhetoric of Feminism, and I should have brought the course packet. It was like this big. So I pulled together all these sources from 1690 Mary Estelle to present, of people saying, why should women have rights, or why should they not have rights? And what really struck me about this was the extent to which Eve came up over and over and over again. Why can't women go to school? Eve. Why can't women be equal in marriage? Eve. Why can't women have professions? Eve. And so, and people had various iterations of this. You know, sometimes it was about, you know, the rib, and women were made to be inferior because of the rib story. Sometimes it was about Eve ate the apple from the tree of knowledge, therefore women were untrustworthy. So there was various spins on this, but the bottom line was, because it was ordained in the Bible for women to be inferior, that explained everything. And I was really struck as, you know, a 21st century person, how solid this myth, I think it's a myth anyway, held, and for how many generations of women were basically like banging their heads against this brick wall of Eve as they sought increased opportunities, and increased, especially even just to be, especially even the right to their own persons, their own bodies in marriage. So my initial question for this research was, what happened when evolutionary theory became popular in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s? Did any women read evolution and think, aha, now we have an alternative origin story. Now we have a story that does not depend on woman being made from the rib of man to be his helper. What kind of future is possible with a different origin story? So one thing we might discuss together as a group is the importance of origin stories, why it matters what we tell ourselves about why we are the way we are, who we are as people, as men and women. I think origin stories matter a lot. I also think the narratives we tell about ourselves as a country matter a lot. That's something that I write a lot about in my new book, Free Thinker, that it matters today that our history textbooks, our monuments, our streets, our buildings do not center or name women. I think that's directly tied to why we have so few women, as Mackie said, 25% in office, because the stories we tell about our past shape what we think is possible in the future. So that's one thing we can discuss. Another thing that we might discuss in our book is the idea of what is natural. So the women I profile in From Eve to Evolution were really drawn to evolutionary theory, not only because it decentered Eve as the story of why women are the way they are, but also because it introduced animals as our ancestors. So women that I profile were really excited by science, and they were excited to look in the animal kingdom and find, for example, that there's no animal precedent for female domesticity. There's no stay-at-home female lioness. You know, so for generations, women had been told it was natural for them to stay home, be the caretaker, devote themselves to husband and children and household at the expense of everything else. But when women read evolutionary theory, they said, well, wait, if we're all on board with science now, and if we believe that humans are part and parcel of the animal kingdom, then female domesticity is unnatural. Why are we doing this? It makes no sense. It thwarts women's development, they said, and it also thwarts the development of children who see like a stunted model in their moms. The other thing that women were really drawn to in evolutionary theory, and this gets a little heady, remember this was my dissertation, and so my first book is more scholarly than my second book, which is aimed towards a more broad audience. But the other part of evolutionary theory that women were really drawn to was Charles Darwin's theory of sexual selection. So everybody knows about natural selection, the survival of the fittest, but Darwin thought, and especially he became increasingly convinced about this, and even said so on his deathbed in 1882, that he thought sexual selection explained the evolution of species even more than natural selection. So what is sexual selection? Sexual selection is basically, think about the peacock. The peacock makes no sense in a natural selection world. The peacock's beautiful plumage is basically saying, hey, predators, here I am, come eat me. So Darwin said, if natural selection is supposed to explain everything, how do we make sense of the peacock? Well, the peacock only makes sense in terms of sexual selection and reproduction. The peacock with the most beautiful plumage might live a very short life because he's so stand out. But in his very short life, that peacock with the most beautiful plumage will be super attractive to all the peahens. So that short-lived peacock will leave the greatest number of progeny, and that is the evolutionary success story. So according to Darwin, there were two elements of sexual selection theory. One, male display, which could either be like fighting or of their beautiful feathers if they were birds. And this is the important part for us, female choice. So Darwin posits that throughout the animal kingdom, until we get to humans, the females of the species make all of the important reproductive decisions: who to mate with, when to mate, and how many babies. So women read this and they said, wait a minute, if humans are part of the animal kingdom, why is it that women have lost the power of reproductive control? Why aren't we in the position to say who we mate with when and how many offspring we will have. So the last chapter of my book really kind of tries to put Darwin evolution in this larger history of women's struggle ongoing for reproductive rights. Other questions we might ask, and kind of a subtext of From Eve to Evolution, are the importance of science for feminism, and more to the point, the importance of women scientists. So as religious explanations for the meaning of life, the origins of life, began to kind of fall out of favor with the American intellectuals, science took their place. Science took its place. But women soon began to see that where they had had such great hope for science, where they thought that science would naturally explain, female equality and open up all these new possibilities for women, instead what happened was that science as a profession, as an institution, it masculinized, meaning it excluded women. So women soon saw that their hopes for science were somewhat thwarted by men's control and by what women felt were the kind of biased studies that scientists embarked upon to prove why women were naturally inferior to men. So another part of From Eve to Evolution is tracing this history of biased studies. So studies, for example, of female menstruation that were purportedly evidence of why women couldn't go to college. Studies of women's brains that supposedly showed why women couldn't go to college or enter the professions. And it wasn't until women entered science that these long-held theories began to be disproven and shown for what they were, which was biased hypotheses. So those are some of the kind of key takeaway messages that I want to highlight. And another thing that we might think about, and this is a few years ago when this book From Eve to Evolution first came out, I did a talk at the Stowe House, and that talk in particular focused on a woman. I have a few main characters in From Eve to Evolution, and one of them was Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and she argued from animals about female domesticity not being natural, and she argued that instead men should do their share of the housework. So my talk at the Stowe House a few years ago centered on Blackwell's arguments from nature for more male participation with child rearing and household tasks, which is, as you may know, still an ongoing issue in 2020. So that's another area that we might explore today in our discussion. That's an introduction to my book and some of its main themes, how it came to be. With my first question, my initial question was, again, what happened when women started reading evolutionary theory? And as soon as I looked, I found women saying exactly what I kind of thought / hoped, hypothesized, I might say, which is that evolution offered many more opportunities. And I'll just end this brief introductory remarks with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the intellectual leader of the 19th century women's rights movement, who wrote in one of my favorite feminist periodicals, which is called Lucifer, the Light Bearer. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in Lucifer, the Light Bearer in 1890, and she said, "What would be the tragedy of the Garden of Eden to a generation of scientific women? Scientific women," she said, "would relegate that tale to the same category as Aesop's fables." So I'm happy to take your questions, comments, objections.
Okay, it looks like Mackie has a question for you.
Since we're, I think at the Matriots, we're kind of into changing the dynamics or changing what I would say the norms of society, right? So as I read your book, Kimberly, one of the things that really occurred to me is that this research that you've done probably informs us something about what does it really take to create a movement that creates massive change? How do, what some of the things that you hear today, for example, is a woman can't be elected president. Although we had the most diverse Democratic field in history, a woman did not manage to get to the top. And I think that was a pervasive fear, whether it was pervasive or not. The media reported it as pervasive. So how do those of us who want to see a more equal opportunity, just, women-friendly world contribute to societal change in a very positive way? Do we have to align ourselves with some man who's thinking something along the lines that we want to think? And kind of that's the way I saw the Eve to evolution was we found this research that contradicted what's been holding us back, and it was done by a man, so it had credibility. Is that the path? Is there a different kind of path? Does it just take time? You know,
That's a great question, Mackie, and I think there are many answers to that. One that is a through line in both my books, From Eve to Evolution and Free Thinker, is the importance of history and the importance of role models and centering different stories. So the women in my first book, From Eve to Evolution, they also wrote a lot of stories about historical matriarchies, which I think you might appreciate as a matriot. So for example, Matilda Jocelyn Gage and other 19th century feminist and women's rights leaders searched history for examples of societies where women led. Some of the women like Antoinette Brown Blackwell also turned to the animal kingdom to find examples of animal species where women were the leaders. So they found a lot of inspiration and traction in making larger claims when they said, when people would say, oh, that's never been done before, to say, oh, well, look at this society, or look at this species, or look at this woman that you've never heard of. So that's why I think the importance of narrative is so important. You know, the historian Jill Lepore, who's one of my favorites, she also writes a lot about the importance of narratives in terms of informing people's politics and choices today. And then the suffragists that I write about in my new book, Free Thinker, were really in many ways our nation's first historians of women. They were the ones who wrote the first, you know, kind of encyclopedias of women, the first who's who, because they understood that for women to have increased opportunities, especially in politics, they were concerned, like we are with women, not just voting, but also holding office, that they needed to have examples, that people needed to know women have always been contributing to social change. And just because we don't know their names, or just because they're excluded from, you know, our museums and our history textbooks, doesn't mean they are already always doing this, because in fact they have been. So suffrage leaders compiled their own history called the History of Women's Suffrage. They created the nation's first women's history archive. So Maud Wood Park, the leader of NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, she then became the first president, the founding president of the League of Women Voters, and she created the first women's rights archive, which was the seed for what is now the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at Harvard, the nation's biggest and most wide-ranging women's history archive. So the suffragists really saw this link very clearly, that our histories have to tell different stories. They sent History of Women's Suffrage to libraries. They sent it to textbook creators to say, hey, tell these stories about women. I recently wrote an op-ed from March 1st in the Washington Post called The Problem with Women's History Month in 2020, where I expand on some of this and give some links. And one link you might want to check out is the National Women's History Museum report from 2017, where they did a comprehensive evaluation of all history textbooks to see how women were represented. And sadly, not much has changed since the suffragists did the exact same thing in 1909. In 1909, the suffragists in the National American NASA, the main suffrage group, convened a committee to study how women were portrayed in history and civics textbooks. And the leader of that committee reported at the annual meeting that history textbooks convey the false impression that the world has been made by men for men. And in 2017, that was essentially what the National Women's History Museum Foundation report found in their survey of history textbooks. So my first answer, and I think really an essential answer, Mackie, is that we need to tell different stories. We need to know that there have always been women doing, you know, aeronautics, science, medicine, politics. Just because we don't know their names, or just because they published as anonymous, or just because their husband took all their work and published it under his name, which is another common theme in history, doesn't mean that women haven't always been doing this, because we always have. So I think we need new role models, new faces, and new stories that we tell about our past.
Thank you, Kimberly.
you.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. It looks like Patricia Summer has a question. If you'd like to go ahead and ask that.
Surely, excuse me, in reference to the masculinization of science, isn't that just a continuation of Judeo-Christian theology? And we're still living with that today. Big time.
Patricia, a great question, and also a great introduction for me to talk about some of my favorite women, including Helen Hamilton Gardner, whose biography I just wrote with Free Thinker. So that is precisely what a lot of the women I write about thought. So Helen Hamilton Gardner has this great quote where she says that as soon as thinking men determined that they couldn't explain everything in terms of who said what to whom in the Garden of Eden, that the great brains of the day called in science and medicine to thwart women's advancement in that way. So it was just a one-for-one replacement. So that's a lot of what these women, so I so far have studied like the fringe, the free thinking, the sex reforming women, the more radicals, and that is precisely what they thought, Patricia, that the way that science and medicine and who populated science and medicine in the 19th century was basically a carry-on of the same ideologies about women. Helen Hamilton Gardner wrote that she had found in her research, and I'll talk more about that in a second, that the stronger a man's faith in the Bible was, the stronger he believed in this Adam and Eve creation story, the more sexist his science was. That she felt that really informed everything they found, moving forward. So Gardner, who I write about in this book, which you may recognize the picture, is a altered version of the Let Ohio Women Vote, the symbol of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association. Well, Gardner, I first learned about her when I was working on my dissertation, and I was in the basement of the library at the University of Texas in Austin, thumbing through all these old editions, and by old I mean 1870s, 1880s, issues of Popular Science Monthly, to see when were men talking about female inferiority, when were women talking about it. And I found all these letters between Helen Hamilton Gardner, a woman who at the time I had never heard of, and this guy, William Hammond Clark, he had been the Surgeon General of the Union Army during the Civil War, and then he went on to help found the American Neurological Association and become its first president. So he's like top dog neurologist. William Hammond was a traditional man, a Christian man, to Patricia's point, who became fascinated with brain science, and especially because he saw the ways that soldiers had been traumatized during the Civil War. He then turned his attention to studying the differences between men's and women's brains. And this was really like one of the most important and prominent questions in the 1870s and 1880s. Why? Because women started trying to go to college in the 1870s. And some women began being allowed to go to college in the 1870s and 1880s in large numbers because the Civil War had decimated the male population and colleges needed people to pay the tuition. Now, William Hammond and others were deeply concerned about the larger implications of this. So Hammond published a study saying that he had found that women's brains were inferior to men's in 19 distinct ways, including weighing less, having thinner gray matter, and less distinct convolutions. So now Helen Hamilton Gardner, who was barred from, she tried to go to Columbia, but women were not allowed to, and Barnard had not yet opened. So she was barred from studying science. But she said to herself, this sounds a lot like the Adam and Eve story, but like dressed up in new scientific jargon, and I'm not buying it. So Gardner prepared a list of 20 questions, basically like kind of lawyerly, logical questions about the differences, the purported differences between men's and women's brains. And she sent her list of questions to other neurologists, and she struck up this vibrant correspondence with this guy, Edward Spitzka, who was another prominent neurologist and kind of a peer of Hammond's. And Spitzker told her, but Spitzker was like of a new generation. He was more modern. He had all sorts of measuring scales and dissecting materials and specimens from all around the world in his laboratory, whereas Hammond's evidence was basically to write his old white guy friends and say, tell me about your female patients. And so he had like anecdotal evidence, whereas Spitzka's was more what we would recognize as modern. So Spitzka tells Gardner that there's absolutely no evidence that women's brains fundamentally differ from men's, that if, Hammond had said basically if you could look at male and female brains, you could tell which was which. And Spitzka says that is nonsense. There's no way you could tell by looking. No one thinks that. And Gardner says, even if there were differences between male and female brains, we should be studying them in infants, not adults, because adults might only show cultural differences and the impact of that over many years. So basically, within these pages of Popular Science Monthly, Gardner, this unknown 30-year-old woman with no formal education, eviscerates Hammond's arguments about women's brains and points out precisely the links that Patricia was saying between a man's kind of original thinking about women, largely based on Adam and Eve, and what they find in science. So now this gets us back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was friends with Helen Hamilton Gardner from the free thought, or what we would call atheist or agnostic, lecture circuit. They had become friends as women speakers on the free thought lecture circuit. Elizabeth Cady Stanton reads about Gardner's science research on brains, and she says, oh, Helen Hamilton Gardner, you must come to this big international gathering we're having in 1888, the International Congress of Women, and you must tell us about your brain research. So that's exactly what Gardner does. So Gardner goes to this gathering. She gives her speech called Sex and Brain, where she dismantles these dominant theories that had been used to bar women from higher education, from the professions. And then she drops a challenge to her women. And this speaks also to Mackie's point about what causes social change. So she issues a challenge. She says, hey, ladies, you are the leading women of Western Europe, of America. And you know what? When scientists compare the brains of men and women, do you know the specimens they prefer? Do any of you guys want to guess what kind of male brains scientists study? Well, of course, they study the brains of other scientists who have donated their brain to say, like, look at me, look how awesome I am. Hopefully science can like document precisely how and why I came to be so smart. And they compare those male brains against those of what Gardner called female hospital pickups, women who died alone on the streets, in insane asylums, impoverished and homeless. So Gardner turns to her audience of leading women in 1888 and says, hey ladies, we need a few specimens. Not only do we need more female scientists, but we need to study the brains of women, of a broad array of women. So Gardner and Stanton pledged to each other that when they die, they will donate their brains to science, so that for the first time, scientists can study the brains of educated women. Now, Stanton's heirs refused her bequest. They thought it was Looney Tunes and that their mom never actually would have agreed to such a thing. So when Gardner dies in 1925, she made sure her will was airtight and that her brain went directly to Cornell, no stopping it go. She even specified the doctor who would remove it from her head. And her brain remains jarred on display outside the psychology department. The New York Times headline said, "Woman's brains not inferior to men's." So yes, I thought that religion and science in many ways were allied, especially in the 19th century, and that it was very important not just for women to contribute to science as scientists, but also for women's bodies, women's perspectives to be included in scientific research, which I think is still very important.
Mm-hmm. Great. It looks like our next question is from Ann Myers. Ann, do you want to ask? All right, so I'll go ahead and read it. Basically, didn't we as women also need to focus on what to do to be complicit in male sexism? How we raise our sons, how we deal with our bosses, how we apologize for being right or good. So do we need to focus on our own complicity in that sexism?
I would say, I guess, yes, in part. And maybe that's part of what we need to do. So another way that I think we can focus on our complicity, and one that I write more about, is the ways in which white women have been complicit in embedding racism and feminism and women's rights from the beginning until now. So that's something we might talk more about, and that a lot of my public talks through the Ohio Humanities Speakers Bureau in particular focus on is the role of race in women's rights. So I think that is for sure something that white women need to focus on. For women more broadly, I think, sure. I think there's been a lot written about how we can band together. So one thing that my colleagues and I do in meetings is, as I'm sure everyone on this phone call knows, when a woman says something in a meeting, no one says anything. And then when a man reiterates it 2 minutes later, everyone says, "Oh my God, Bob's so smart. Bob, what a great idea." So me and my female friends have made a pact that when that happens to us, we will do it for the other. So like, I wouldn't have to be the one saying, "Bob, I said that first." Instead, Mackie would say, oh, I think actually Kimberly said that 2 minutes ago. And I really appreciated when Kimberly articulated it before Bob, so that we're not the ones doing it for ourselves. So yes, I think there are many things we can do, raising our sons, dealing with our bosses, not saying sorry. On my middle-aged ladies tennis team, we have a rule that says, when you say sorry, you have to do a push-up. So I think there are many ways we can like re-socialize ourselves to not apologize, to say our piece, to amplify each other. But in terms of like formal things that we can do to dismantle sexism, I also think we need to put race in there, in particular for the and racism in the way that white women have been complicit in that over the past 200 years and more.
It looks like the next question is from Colleen. Colleen, do you want to ask your question verbally?
Sure, Kimberly, thank you very much. Recently there have been some filmmakers like Reese Witherspoon and Ava DuVernay who have focused on women in film. And I wonder if that's a way that you think we can start to change the perceptions that children may not get in textbooks in history.
Yes, 1,000,000%. I could not agree with that more. So the stories we tell, I don't just mean in history textbooks, but films, so many more people see films and documentaries, unfortunately for better or worse, than read books. So yes, I could not agree more. And I can't remember if this line got edited out of my Washington Post op-ed about Women's History Month, but at one point I had a paragraph in there saying like, until we do have more women in history textbooks, it's up to us as parents and educators and concerned citizens to expand our children's and our own view of the world by the films we see, the documentaries we watch, the museum exhibitions we go to, the YouTube, videos we watch. There's so many great women's history podcasts and YouTube channels. So yes, I mean, I love what Ava DuVernay and Reese Witherspoon are doing. And I could not agree more that yes, the impact of female filmmakers is huge. Although as a historian, sometimes I cringe a little. Like for example, I'm super into the new series, Mrs. America. I don't know if you guys have been watching that on FX on Hulu, but I've been writing about that kind of, like a historical context. I wrote something for BBC History Extra last week, and I've been really interested in that. But I have to say the historians, while we love it and while it's awesome to see like women's history being portrayed on the big screen, we also sort of get our feathers rankled, ruffled when we see the big screen effect of things that aren't exactly true. So like Mrs. America makes Phyllis Schlafly out to be like so nice, so beautiful, when it downplays some of the hateful things she said, the hate she incited. And the same with the other big women's history thing that people know about is the Iron Jawed Angels film from HBO, which I also love, but as a historian who writes a lot about suffrage, there's so many errors. So in general, yes, I totally agree, Colleen, but there are also some dangers in this popularization of history that, glamorizes Phyllis Schlafly and gives Alice Paul a hot boyfriend when Alice Paul had no hot boyfriends.
I completely understand that. When I was a high school social studies teacher, I taught it was like a film class that was history and film. And we watched Iron Jawed Angels, but we had to talk about what did they add to it,
Yeah.
what characters did they make. But
Yeah.
overall, I thought it was a good depiction of this is what the suffragists went through, but you have to understand that they Hollywoodized it.
Yes.
So we always talked about the Hollywoodization of the movies that we saw in that class.
Yes.
But the next question comes from Abigail.
Yes, I was just wondering if you see a way forward for women who choose to still be part of their religious communities to also be part of expanding the influence of women in civic society.
Yes, I mean, the history is overflowing with examples of religious women. So just my personal research has focused more on the free-thinking women, but for sure, you could point to many amazing examples, current and past, of women who are active in their religious societies and who bring that to civic society. One that I'm actually been teaching about this week, I'm a professor at Miami University, and this week, one of my classes were focusing on women in the civil rights movement and also second wave feminism. So the woman we're focusing on is Pauli Murray, who I feel like is one of the most unsung heroines of all time and who everyone should know. There's a great biography of her called Jane Crow. And Pauli Murray, she was excluded from college and at first from law school for being Black. And so she helped create the legal strategy that was not only used to dismantle segregation in Brown v. Board of Education by focusing on a separate part of separate but equal, but also the legal strategy that Ruth Bader Ginsburg began to use to dismantle sex discrimination in the 1960s and 70s. So, and she ended her life by becoming an ordained minister. So yes, she was one example of a woman whose religion very much informed her life and who in fact became a minister at the end of her life. So yes, I think of course there are many examples of women active in religious groups who are also great civic leaders. And my next book actually is going to focus on women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the importance of temperance. I feel like the temperance ladies really get a bad rap historically for being, like cranky old ladies who want to take away your party. And I really think we need to reframe them as the Me Too movement of the 19th century, because I don't think from my research that what was really animating the temperance movement was alcohol as much as it was violence against women and especially sexual violence. And I think people today don't understand many things about the past, but one of them, which has been a real revelation to me, and sorry to tell you this at lunchtime, but that syphilis was such a scourge, that syphilis was more common than all other infectious diseases combined in the 19th century. So now that I have learned to look and see the coded ways that women were talking about syphilis because they couldn't say it outright, now I see it everywhere. And that's really one of the main things that I think motivated the women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So I feel like those Christian ladies are another big example of women who used religion to make a huge difference on civil society. And I really think that they were the Me Too movement of the 19th century.
That's interesting, and I appreciate that because, again, when I was teaching high school social studies, and it was 10th grade, so we were talking about, the Progressive Era, and then we were talking about, well, what caused prohibition, and talking about, women were framing the argument for prohibition as, their husbands would, get their paycheck, and then they would go to the bar, and then they would spend all the money, and they would come home drunk and beat up the wife and kids. And when to explain to teenagers, well, why is it that people wanted to stop alcohol? Because teenagers are all about, can't wait to drink alcohol. So that was kind of the way I had to frame it in terms of this was the reason why they thought it was so important. Now, the prohibition experiment went terribly wrong and it backfired in so many ways, but that was the initial impetus for it. So let's see. Oh, we do have another question from Patricia. So, Patricia, are you there? Oh, I don't see her. Patricia Summer, you want to go ahead and ask your next question?
Could we not benefit from interpretation of Scripture by women? From the woman's point of view, Scripture has always been interpreted by men, and it's about time that we have our say, and I think that's legitimate.
So I think, Patricia, will really like my new book, Free Thinker. Because, again, that is exactly what Helen Hamilton Gardner said. So as I mentioned, Helen Hamilton Gardner is a character in the book that we're technically discussing today, From Eve to Evolution, because of her work on brain science. But how Helen Hamilton Gardner first came to public life was on the free thought lecture circuit. So she was known as Ingersoll and Soprano for giving speeches about what the Bible had to say about women. And then she wrote her first book, which I was just looking, it's one of the books propping up my computer, but I will show you. She wrote her first book. It was called Men, Women, and Gods, and it was a compilation of her free thought lectures. And what she is essentially doing, now I put it back in my stack, is explaining the Bible from a woman's standpoint. And she did this years before Matilda Jocelyn Gage published Women, Church, and State, which is another effort to do just that. And then Gardner was one of the women who joined Elizabeth Cady Stanton's controversial Women's Bible Revising Committee. And the Women's Bible is something, a really significant in the history of women's rights that I talk about in both my books. So Stanton was trying to do precisely what Patricia Summer is saying women need to do, which is interpret the Bible from a woman's point of view. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had come to believe that the Bible was, I should say especially the Bible as interpreted by men, was the root cause of women's oppression. So in the 1880s, she began increasingly turning her attention to that. Now, this made her colleagues in the women's suffrage movement very nervous because Stanton was going around saying things like marriage is legalized prostitution and the Bible is the source of women's oppression. So her suffrage colleagues were trying very much to seem like mainstream, acceptable. And here's Stanton spouting off against the Bible and talking about marriage as prostitution. So they did not want to have anything to do with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Women's Bible Project. But Stanton thought that it would be her greatest contribution to women's rights. So she published what she called the Woman's Bible, and it was what the Women's Bible is a compilation of all the sections of the Bible which mention women, which is also something that Gardner does in Men, Women, and Gods, and then commentary from leading women of various religions on how they interpret these sections. So in the Woman's Bible, Stanton covers all the sections, and in Men, Women, and Gods, Helen Hamilton Gardner focuses only on the ones that are about things like gang rape or selling your daughter to a horde of men, and the really kind of more nefarious elements of what the Bible says about women. And the Women's Bible by Stanton covers all of the sections. But this was super controversial in women's rights. And in 1890, when the suffragists merged with the Christian temperance ladies, Stanton is effectively ousted. And then later in 1895, the suffragists are so upset about Stanton's Women's Bible and all the bad press it's been receiving that they pass a formal resolution censoring it and saying, oh no, we the nice, Christian lady suffragists have nothing to do with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her crazy Women's Bible Project.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I remember reading the Women's Bible when I was in college.
Yeah.
But when I went down to my basement to the books that are in boxes, I could not find it, so I have no idea what happened to it over the years. It looks like the next question comes from Mackie. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
Kimberly, it's not so much a question as just a thought that of connecting your work with Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Kimmerer. I'm not sure exactly how. The
Okay.
Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you've read it, but she tells the Native American creation story in her book as she opens this book. As she's a Native American woman and a biologist.
Okay.
And so she writes the Native American creation story, which is, I was in tears reading it because it really deepens what you said early on and answer my first question, how narrative and story frame our thinking. And for me, I found it just to be very healing. I was raised with the Eve story of creation as how women are viewed in the world and story as growing up in the Methodist Church. And so I think until I read the story, as much as I had heard what you said early, but from many people about how narrative frames it and how stories matter, it wasn't until I read her version of it, which was so uplifting and empowering of women in the creation story, that I really just could see how, if that was the story my mother had told me, how it would have framed a whole different life future for me. Yeah.
A whole different life, a whole different world of possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And just to build on that, I want to mention another scholar who you all might be interested in, and it's a woman named Sally Roche Wagner. she has written a lot about Matilda Jocelyn Gage. So Matilda Jocelyn Gage was another founding women's rights leader and suffrage advocate from the 19th century, and she wrote the book Woman, Church, and State that I mentioned earlier. But Matilda Jocelyn Gage, like me and like Susan B. Anthony, is from upstate New York. So according to Sally Roche Wagner, Matilda Jocelyn Gage's ideas about women's rights are very much informed by the Native American communities, the Iroquois, and other groups around which she grew up. And so just to your point about like really not like specifically the importance of Native American creation stories and as influencing women's rights historically, that's an argument that Sally Roche Wagner makes. And she has a new book timed for the suffrage centennial. I haven't read it yet, but I saw that it really does center these Native American creation stories and also the contributions of Native American women as influencing women's rights in the US and also as having a much more powerful origin story for all of us. So yes, another thing I wanted to say to Mackie's point about the importance of stories and seeing names in places is, I don't know if you all have seen this essay that I love. You can Google it later. It's by Rebecca Solnit, who's a writer who I love. She's not a historian, but she's an amazing writer. And she has this essay called City of Women, where she writes and invites us to imagine what would the world be like if we walked around and saw women's names places. And she even commissioned a cartographer to redo the New York City subway map and rename every stop for women. So love it. I teach it in my women's history class and my students love it too. And so it's just amazing to think like, what would the world be like if we saw women's names everywhere? And in my women's history class in the fall, my students loved it so much that we made that our final project, where we did research about women at Miami University and redid our campus map to imagine, you know, gardens, buildings, memorials to women and how different that would be. And some students also did imaginary memorials to women from their hometowns, and some of them are even in the process of getting them made. So I think to Mackie's earlier point about like how can we change what leads to lasting social change, that's one thing we could do is, you know, really start and promote these efforts to rename, to center, to remember women.
That's actually something that I've thought about and mentioned at various times. You know, we're part of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. We are part of the Ohio History Connection.
Yep.
And the Ohio History Connection has 57 or 58 sites around the state. Some of them are, you know, very Native American oriented, and some of them are forts and battle type oriented. But there is only one that is named solely for a woman, the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. The only other one that has a woman's name in it is the John and Annie Glenn House. And I think that's even a bit of a misnomer because it's actually John's boyhood home and Annie Glenn never lived there.
Wow.
But even in terms of, you know, why is it not called the John and Jean Rankin House? Because in terms of Underground Railroad information, I see John Getz nodding his head. But in terms of Underground Railroad, the women people who were involved in Underground Railroad activities were just as important in many ways as the men who were involved in Underground Railroad activities.
Yeah.
So it's just, it just reminds me of, you know, something that I've always said about the Ohio Historical Connection, you know, Ohio History Connection, and what our role as the only female-centered site should be, etc. There's no more questions in the chat right now, but I have actually two different questions that I want to ask, and one can be kind of brief. Just for the people who are not as familiar with the historian's craft, can you just kind of give a brief overview of what it takes to research a book like this? What kind of process would you have to go through in terms of researching and coming up with all of this information from so many different women sources?
That's a great question. Thank you. So as I mentioned, From Eve to Evolution began as my dissertation, and I just had this open-ended question basically about, first of all, did women embrace or get excited about evolutionary theory? So I first found out yes, and then my second question was, okay, how and what did that mean? So what I did for From Eve to Evolution is I tried to think of all the places where men were talking about what it meant to be female. So that was like, medical journals, scientific journals, speeches, and then where women were saying what it meant to be male or female. So that was women's rights periodicals. So I was fortunate to get a bunch of fellowships to go to different archives across the country where I could study old periodicals, old newsletters, meeting minutes. So I looked at things like, my research was in part before suffrage, so it was more like women's rights organizations or professional women's clubs, women's book clubs, to see, did women read science? If so, what did they say about it? And then I would look at male scientists and say, like, okay, what were the scientists saying? How were they interpreting evolution to be making claims about what it meant to be male or female? And in particular, I realized that the main thing people were talking about in order to understand what it meant to be male or female was Darwin's theory of sexual selection. So that was kind of one of my keyword search terms that I would look for in these old periodicals. So my first book was more of an intellectual history of ideas, history of how men and women interpreted evolutionary theory to understand what it meant to be male or female. And for that, it was years of research, some using letters and documents, mostly using printed sources like speeches, periodicals, newspapers. And then once you find all the material, then you have to make sense of it, right? Like, so who cares if I have 10 binders full of documents from old periodicals and books? What does it mean? So then it's the process of sifting and sorting and putting like things together. So then I tried to organize kind of by theme. My first book is a little bit chronological. Each chapter it sort of goes in chronological order, and it's focused on one woman usually, or one publication that is kind of exemplary of these larger trends. But it's mostly thematic. So, there's the chapter about origin stories, and there's a chapter about higher education, which I mentioned, which was a big part where science came to be the arbiter of whether or not women could go to college. And there's a chapter on domesticity and female housework. So I organized by theme. So then I would take all of my hundreds of documents and try to sort them by themes. And now, because Charles Darwin had such an impact on American life and intellectual life, that was a doozy to research. It was pretty early on in working on From Eve to Evolution that I decided my next book would be a biography of Helen Hamilton Gardner. She's one of the 4 women that I write about in my first book, but I really wanted to focus on her, in part because she seems so fascinating, and in part because research-wise, Christina, it seems so much more awesome to just follow one woman. So I thought, gosh, this will be a clear path. All I have to do is follow this one woman. Now, little did I know that this path would also be really challenging because, Gardner mandated in her will that her papers be destroyed, so she didn't leave much of a trace. So I had to do a lot of searching, but it was so fun. It was so much more fun to research than my first book because I was part historian and part Magnum PI. Where did she go? Who did she meet? Where did she live? So I not only used traditional historical sources like archives and, historical newspapers and magazines, but I also went all the places that she ever lived. I followed her around. I did things like wait on the corner at 8:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in front of her apartment in New York City to see if someone came out so that I could introduce myself and say, hi, I really want to know about the history of this building. It was just very fun. So very different strategies for each book. One focused on history of ideas and the second focused on a woman. But for each, it's a process of collecting the documents, sorting them, and then trying to make meaning of them.
Okay, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Actually, we do have a new question from Ellen Green Bush, if she wants to ask the question before I ask my next one. Ellen? Don't hear from her. So I'll go ahead and read it it says, speaking of women as unknown and unsung in history, I'm struck by the role of women, or the role women are playing as healthcare professionals, caretakers, and service workers, mostly underpaid in this difficult time.
Yes, I see that also as a through line in history. You can see a lot of links between World War I, the Civil War, World War II, and our current crisis of the role of women, often women of color, often underpaid women. I think Ellen might be, the article that really struck me about this was the one from the New York Times, really specifying the percentages of women. I think this was last week. Ellen may have another one in mind, but that's the one I read, where it specifies percentages of women who are considered essential workers. And it's overwhelming, you know, so it's really women, and by and large women of color, who are keeping us going, who are performing the essential labor during our pandemic. So 1000% I agree with Ellen's comment on that. And I think it's a through line throughout history.
Okay, my next question changes gears just a little bit. And that is, I really, in your book, I really paid a lot of attention to chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big characters of chapter 3 is Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Yep.
And what I'm interested in terms of at the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, you know, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's grandmother was Harriet's sister.
Yep.
And, you know, it talks about, you know, and I knew a little bit about this, but I don't know as much as I want to find out. But, you know, Charlotte's father was part of this Beecher clan, and he abandoned his family. And so she was kind of cut, I would assume, kind of cut off from the Beechers a little bit. But I want to know more about, you know, what was her relationship with her grandmother, Mary Perkins, and the larger Beecher family. So I made a list of all of the biographies that you had noted for that chapter 3. And I'm asking, like, what would be the best one for me to go to find out more about Charlotte Perkins Gilman's family life and her family influences or lack of influence, even though she's connected to the Beecher family?
Great question. So I would start with Judith Allen's biography. And the other one that I really like is Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz's, which focuses more specifically on the writing of the Yellow Wallpaper. But Judith Allen's I really love. It's an intellectual biography, but it begins also with her relationship with her father. So for those who are not as familiar with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who haven't read chapter 3, I also want to say a little bit about your question about the role of her father and wealth and her relation to the Beechers. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was one of the most, you know, well-known feminist intellectuals of the turn of the 20th century, was a Beecher, like a poor Beecher cousin. Her father abandoned the family when she and her brother were young. Her mother tried to support them, but that basically meant they moved more than once a year. So I can't remember precisely how many homes she lived in by the time she was 18, but it was more than once a year they had to move. And she writes really movingly about her mother, who had been a talented and gifted musician, how the mother had to sell their piano to pay for food. And what that really struck Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So she existed in this like Beecher sphere of people with more money, and she would maybe stay at their home for a few months at a time. So she was like wealth adjacent without having any wealth herself. But what the message that Charlotte Perkins Gilman took from her really, you know, economically strained childhood and her relationship with her father was that women had to be economically self-sufficient. That is Gilman's #1 message in life. Her first big book was called Women and Economics, and there she lays out her claim, and that's mostly what I talk about in chapter 3. That's where she lays out her claim that it's unnatural. There's no evolutionary precedent for females, for women, to be economically dependent on men. So she thinks this intellectually, she thinks it scientifically, but she also really felt it personally, growing up and seeing that her mother had no way to support the family other than selling things or going to live temporarily with her more wealthy family members. So she thought, Charlotte Perkins Gilman basically, you know, made a pact with herself, like, I will never do this. I will never depend economically on a man. And that was the cornerstone of her thinking. And she wrote dozens of books, fiction, nonfiction, utopian fiction. She had a magazine called The Forerunner that she put out for many years, where she put, you know, articles and essays, but her kernel, her core idea is that women should be economically self-sufficient. And that's the only way, you know, we will see change, and that that women could really truly enter equally into all realms of life.
All right, well, thank you for those recommendations. We do have kind of a question comment from Martine. Martine, do you want to ask that? Not, I can read it. She says, Thank you for your presentation. And do you plan on making a comparative study amongst religions as it impacted on leadership from Golda Meir to Muslim and Christian women in Europe? Broad ranging.
I think would be no. That's a question, and I think that many other historians and scholars of religion do delve into those questions, but that I don't see in my future. As I said, I think my next book will focus on the temperance movement because I'm pretty centered on women in the US, 19th and 20th centuries, on questions of sex, politics, and social change. So that will be my, I think, area. But I could imagine that there's many other terrific books on those topics that are very important and super timely. They just will not be written by me.
Okay, thank you. And then Shiloh had another question that she wanted me to ask, saying, could you say more about the racism elements of the women that you studied? So you
Yes.
suggest their understanding of race was more of a function of the time than a closely held conviction by these women that non-whites were considered inferior.
So in my first book, From Eve to Evolution, I talk a lot, obviously, about Darwinism, but also social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is more like the ideas of Herbert Spencer, where they sought to apply evolutionary theory to social life. And a lot of these social Darwinian ideas of the 19th century that became very popular hypothesized that there was a hierarchy of civilization from brown low to white high, that brown people were evolving and that white people were the most superior. So a lot has been written by great scholars like Gail Biederman about the ways in which evolutionary theory, as broadly defined, is very much bound up in ideas about racial hierarchy and racist ideas about racial hierarchy. So a lot of the women that I write about in my first book also kind of adapted those ideas that somehow whiteness was a more evolved way to be. The comments I was making earlier about racism in the women's rights movement were more specifically about the role of race and racism in the suffrage movement. And that's a key theme in my new book, Free Thinker, which just came out in March. And that's the story of this woman, Helen Hamilton Gardner, who ends up becoming the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington, D.C. And you can really see through Helen Hamilton Gardner's negotiations with the Wilson White House and with members of Congress, the role of white racism and really the extent to which white leaders, and in this case, white congressmen, went through and continue to go through to keep Black people from the polls. So a kind of shorthand version of this I published on June 4th, which was the 100th, June 4th, 2019, which was the 100th anniversary of congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. So I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post called How Racism Almost Killed Women's Right to Vote. And that gives there's some hyperlinks and some real clear examples of the role of race in debates about the 19th Amendment. And by the teens, the 19 teens, the main objection to women voting had nothing to do with women's brains or, the family will end if women vote, which is what people used to say in the 19th century. But by the 1910s, pretty much the main objection, the only thing members of Congress are talking about is Black women voting in the South. That is their main objection. They're afraid not only that the 19th Amendment will enfranchise Black women, but also that the 19th Amendment will somehow compel the federal government to enforce the 15th Amendment, which on paper enfranchised Black men, but had never been enforced and had been flagrantly flouted since 1877. So that was the main issue in debates about the 19th Amendment, is expanding the Black electorate. So white suffragists basically kind of capitulated and said, fine, we don't care about the 15th Amendment, just let white women vote.
All right. Next question from John Getz. Go ahead.
Oh, this is a question for Kimberly.
Yes.
In your book, you mentioned at some point that a high percentage of the professional women in Antoinette Brown Blackwell's era were named Blackwell.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned Elizabeth Blackwell. Were they related at all?
Yes, that was her sister-in-law.
Okay.
So she married the brother. Antoinette Brown went to Oberlin and became best friends with Lucy Stone. So on the train to Oberlin in Ohio in the 1830s or 40s, now I forget which year she graduated, but on the train to Ohio, someone had said, oh, now when you get to Oberlin, no matter what you do not become friends with Lucy Stone. She is far too radical. So of course, when Antoinette Brown gets to Oberlin, who is the first person she looks for? Lucy Stone. So Lucy Stone was already active in the abolition movement. So Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown become best friends, and then they marry Blackwell brothers. And the Blackwell brothers they marry are the brothers of Elizabeth Blackwell and Emily Blackwell. So the Blackwells are like the Beechers, right, in terms of 19th century reforming, achieving families.
Yeah, I have another question that's sort of a whimsical one, I guess. Did any of the women who read evolutionary science, go to the insect world and
Yes.
the praying mantis? Or...
Yes, they love the praying mantis and the male stickleback. Antoinette Blackwell and I think Gilman also write a lot about the male stickleback, and they write also about various fish too, male fish who sit on the eggs. I can't remember specifically which species now, but yes, there was a lot of insects that they found inspirational in the division of domestic labor and in the ways in which they conceptualized reproduction. Yep.
Thank you.
Backs and praying mantis for sure.
All right, well, it is already 1:15. I have had a great time. I hope everyone else has too. Do we have any last questions, or does Mackie or Barbara Furr have any last questions or comments to make before we wrap up?
I would just say thank you to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House for sponsoring this, and thank you, Kimberly, for sharing your wisdom. I have had a delightful time, and it's always great to be around other feminists and to spend time with them, and this has been extraordinary. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Christina?
I can.
Okay, I just wanted to alert everybody that our next book is We Are Your Sisters, Black Women in the 19th Century. So maybe we can get some of the other side of the story.
I like that idea. Thank you. And that will be in June?
June, yes.
Do you have the date in front of you?
I think it's 27th, the fourth Saturday.
It's the fourth Saturday in June. At that point, we don't know what things are going to look like, so I don't know if we'll be able to do an in-person talk or if we'll plan something like this as well, which I think was kind of fun. So
yeah, this worked very well.
Good. All right. Anyone else? Yes, Kimberly. Yes, of course.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I was really heartened to see such a great turnout, and I love all your questions. This has been a highlight and a really wonderful discussion, and I especially want to thank our organizers, the Harriet Beecher Stowe House and the Semicolon Book Club and the Matriots. And then I have a question for the Matriots. Matriots, do you want to remind us about the important thing that's happening on the 27th and what we need to do between now and Tuesday? Especially in Ohio 1.
So,
you know what I'm talking about? To get our absentee ballots in
Yes.
by Tuesday.
so I would give you a little notice. I am a Kentuckian.
Oh, okay.
So I am a founding member, and I am very engaged with the Matriots because I believe that wherever feminism spreads their light is good for all of us. And I hope that one day there'll be a Matriots Kentucky. So I apologize for Kimberly for not taking your lead there.
Yeah, that's so. I will say it for you, everyone. Be sure you get your primary ballots in by the 27th by mail or in person by the 28th.
That is absolutely true. The Harriet Beecher Stowe House is in Ohio District 1. I live in Ohio District 2 because apparently the line is very strange. But yes, so everyone make sure that you vote in the primary. And I already did that. So thank you all again for coming. We want to thank Kimberly Hamlin for giving us this great sharing of information and sharing of her knowledge about this topic. And there's some other information in the chat about voting. So if you don't have all of that information, you can take a look there. All right, we will go ahead and close up for today. Again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again soon at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House.
Thank you.
Thank you.